Connie Converse. Connie Converse was a practically unknown musician from the 1950s until her music was featured on a radio show in 2004. After this time, her personal story has become as much of an interest to people as her music, partly due to the fact that in August 1974, days after her 50th birthday, Connie left her home and disappeared. Her fate has never been established to this day. Connie was a highly intelligent woman. Her brother described her as a genius and a polymath. Friends and family described Connie as like she was from outer space and like she had one foot in another world. Her father was a minister and she had a strict religious upbringing. Due to her outstanding academic achievements, Connie won a scholarship to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. However, her parents were devastated when she dropped out of college after 2 years and moved to Greenwich Village, New York. She worked in a printing house and began a career as a writer. Within a few years, she had some essays about US relations in the Pacific published in the Canadian peer-reviewed journal called Pacific Affairs. During this time, Connie also began painting, drawing cartoons, playing guitar and writing poetry and music. She recorded her songs at home in her small apartment. Connie was credited as being one of the first modern solo singer-songwriters, as her songs were full of personal struggles and emotions, and her music is often described as way ahead of its time. Because of this, Connie's music career never quite took off, despite an appearance on the morning show on CBS. In 1961, Connie gave up her dream of making it big. She grew frustrated by the quick success of other artists on the New York scene like Bob Dylan. She moved to Michigan and got involved in political activism. She took on several increasingly demanding jobs, eventually becoming managing editor of the Journal of Conflict Resolution. She was also smoking and drinking heavily. By 1973, Connie was 49 years old and had become physically burnt out and depressed. She felt as though she had made no significant achievements in her artistic and professional life, and according to her family, she had not even had one romantic relationship. Her friends financed a 6-month trip to England in the hopes of improving her mood, but it didn't help. Connie also had some health issues around this time, and was told she needed a hysterectomy. Her mother insisted that Connie attend an upcoming family trip to Alaska, which did nothing but make her become even more withdrawn. In 1974, a week after her 50th birthday, Connie wrote letters to her close family and friends saying she was leaving her life behind. She wrote, "Let me go. Let me be if I can. Let me not be if I can't. Human society fascinates me and awes me and fills me with grief and joy. I just can't find my place to plug into it." She also left a check with her brother, requesting him to pay her health insurance until a certain date. After this time, her family never saw or heard from Connie again. It's never been established if Connie took her own life or if she ever did manage to find happiness. It's nice to think that Connie was alive somewhere in 2004 to see her music finally get some appreciation. She would have been 80 years old, but it could be possible. The more I researched Connie's life, the more I felt saddened by her story. She was clearly a highly intelligent and sensitive woman, and was ahead of her time, which left her feeling alienated and unable to focus on one talent. I hope that whatever happened to Connie, she somehow managed to find solace and peace. Richey Edwards. Richey Edwards was a guitarist and lyricist for the Welsh rock band Manic Street Preachers in the early 90s. Despite not being the frontman, he was arguably the most prominent member of the band due to his controversial views and openness about his mental health issues at a time when mental health was not widely acknowledged. This changed, however, when Richey left a London hotel on the 1st of February 1995 and was never seen again. Richey struggled with depression, alcoholism, anorexia and self-harm, so it may seem obvious to presume that he took his own life. But there is so much mystery behind his behaviour leading up to his disappearance, and he was such a complex person that his fate is still widely debated today. Richey was highly intelligent and had a degree in political history. He could easily read 5 books in a week and was a huge fan of philosophy and poetry. These things are quite evident in the band's earlier albums, where Richey wrote roughly 80% of the song lyrics. He became an icon to the angst-ridden youth of the 90s and people struggling with their own mental health issues. Before I get into the disappearance, it's worth noting that Richey appears to have always had a fascination with the concept of disappearing. Several of his favourite books and TV shows had this theme, and he even wrote a story about staging a disappearance to escape problems for a school project. Several people he looked up to were also known for reclusive behaviour, such as the author J.D. Salinger, who withdrew from society after the success of his novel Catcher in the Rye. Richey's mental health and self-destructive tendencies did appear to worsen in the year leading up to his disappearance. This was in part due to the death of the band's manager and the suicide of one of Richey's friends from university, and Kurt Cobain. In June 1994, he vanished for 48 hours and went on an extreme drinking binge. This, combined with an increase in self-harming and anorexia, led to him being committed to hospital and transferred to the Priory Clinic in Roehampton for 10 weeks of rehabilitation. People around him noted that although this improved his eating and drinking habits, he became even more withdrawn and antisocial after staying at the Priory. The self-harming also became much worse and extreme. I don't want to go into the details about this, but several incidents of this were so bad that in December 1994, just a few months before his disappearance, the band had to cancel the rest of their European tour. By January 1995, with just a month until his disappearance, the Manics were rehearsing for their 4th studio album, and Richey, along with frontman James Dean Bradfield, were also preparing for a promotional tour of America. Richey told his mother he did not want to go on this tour. 2 weeks before the disappearance, Richey returns home with his sister after the death of the family's 17-year-old pet dog. Richey was extremely upset to bury his childhood friend. It was around this time that Richey began withdrawing £200 a day from his bank account and continued to do so until the day he vanished. On January 31st, Richey and James check into the London Embassy Hotel in preparation for the trip to America. Richey originally planned to go out with James Bradfield that night, but changed his mind and stayed in his room. His actions from this moment on become patchy, as no one officially sees him again from this moment on. It's believed a woman called Viv visited him that evening, but details of who she is or her whereabouts are unknown. Having failed to meet James in the lobby the next morning, his room was searched and staff found his luggage and a hand-decorated box full of books and personal items labelled "For Joe." It appears that Richey then drove home to his flat in Cardiff, Wales, where family later find his passport, credit cards and Prozac all left behind. 2 weeks later, his car was found in the Severn Bridge car park in England. For anyone who isn't British, the Severn Bridge is considered the main crossing point between England and Wales. The bridge is unfortunately a hotspot for suicides. The car appeared to have been lived in, and pictures of Richey's family were on the seat. The car battery was dead. This led to the obvious suggestion that Richey had committed suicide, although no body has ever been found. Further concerns of suicide were suspected due to the similarity of Richey's disappearance and the suicide of Ian Curtis, the singer of British band Joy Division. Ian Curtis died the night before the band's American tour. Richey was a fan of his. However, there were several reported sightings of Richey in Newport, Wales, in the 2 weeks before his car was found, and interestingly, one of them was in a passport office. He also shaved his head, which drastically altered his appearance weeks before his disappearance, which would have made recognising him more difficult. One of his friends also claims that the night before he vanished, Richey gave him a book called Novel with Cocaine, about a man who vanishes after spending time in an asylum. Although his actual fate is not known, Richey certainly left several hints that he may have just left his life behind. But his fragile mental state, increasing self-harm, and the ominous place where his car was abandoned, and leaving behind his passport and bank cards, could paint a different picture. If you're interested in hearing more about this case, I recommend watching Unite Planet's documentary, as they delve deeper into possible theories of what happened to Richey. I will leave a link to the video in the description box below. Jim Sullivan. Jim Sullivan was an American singer-songwriter from San Diego, California, who vanished in the Santa Rosa Desert, New Mexico on March 6, 1975. Jim developed a passion for music at a young age after listening to local blues groups, and soon became inspired to become a singer-songwriter. He and his wife Carol moved to Los Angeles in 1968 to further his music career. Carol landed a job at Capitol Records, and Jim soon gained popularity from playing in LA's prestigious music venues. He made friends with many big names and seemed destined for success. His friends financed the recording of Jim's first album titled UFO, which also featured many of the top session musicians of the day. Carol obviously had connections to Capitol Records, but despite the obvious support for Jim in the LA music scene, they declined releasing UFO. It was eventually released through the record label of another of Jim's friends, but reached limited success. He released a second self-titled album in 1972, but again it failed to reach critical success. Jim began to drink heavily as his music career didn't seem to be progressing, and after growing increasingly frustrated, Jim and his wife agreed to move to Nashville in 1975 to see if Jim could get a career break through the country music scene. Jim left alone on March the 4th with the agreement that Carol and the children would join him in Nashville once Jim had settled. Unfortunately, this would be the last time that Jim's family ever saw him. He drove his Volkswagen Beetle for 15 hours straight before being pulled over by police for swerving and reckless driving near Santa Rosa, New Mexico. They mistakenly think Jim is under the influence, so take him to the station for testing. Having proved he was sober, they conclude he is suffering with exhaustion and tell him to get some rest in a nearby hotel before proceeding any further. Jim checks into a hotel room but does not unload any of his belongings. Later reports also suggest that he did not sleep in the bed. At some point during the day, Jim goes into a local shop and calls his wife and buys a large bottle of vodka. Jim is then seen driving through the Santa Rosa area and heads southeast towards the isolated desert. After driving another 26 miles, Jim pulls over by a ranch owned by the Italian Ghinetti family. The details of what happened here are unclear, but it is thought that Mrs. Ghinetti either spots Jim on her land and confronts him, or Jim knocks on the ranch door and the two briefly speak at the home. This is the last known sighting of Jim. He supposedly walks off into the desert and is never seen again. Jim's family call the police after failing to contact him for several days. After retracing his steps, they find Jim's abandoned car on the Ghinetti ranch. The car is full of Jim's belongings, including his money, and the engine is completely dead. The surrounding desert is searched by several police units, but Jim is never found. As local and state police begin an investigation, the Santa Rosa sheriff retires and the Genneti family move to Hawaii. These things could be a coincidence or could imply something more sinister. There are no leads in the case for several weeks until an unidentified body is discovered in another New Mexico town. The body had similar height, weight, and facial features as Jim, but police later say that it was not him. However, the identity of the body was never released, making some speculate that it could have in fact been Jim. And this is where the investigation goes completely cold. In 2010, Matt Sullivan, the founder of Light in the Attic Records, discovered and re-released Jim's UFO album. After becoming intrigued with his story, he did his own thorough investigation around Jim's disappearance, but despite interviewing relatives and retracing Jim's steps, he found no new information. So now I want to touch on some of the theories as to what happened. We know that Jim was suffering from fatigue after driving for 15 hours and appears not to have taken a rest like the police suggested. After buying the vodka, did he drive intoxicated and exhausted into the desert and get lost? We know the car engine was dead, so did he break down and ask Mrs. Genneti for help, but to no avail? It has been suggested that Mrs. Genneti did not speak very good English and maybe didn't understand Jim, especially if he was drunk. Or she may have been too wary to listen and help him, as Jim was a 6'3" stranger, which could have seemed intimidating as they were in the middle of nowhere. Both these situations could have made Jim wander off into the desert, potentially drunk, exhausted, and not thinking properly, and he could have died in the desert. But if this was the case, then where is the body? Another theory is that the Gennetis killed Jim after an altercation on their property, and disposed of the body, which is why he has never been found. There is no evidence to support this, but their move to Hawaii right before the investigation could be seen as suspicious. Some people believe that Jim willingly wandered off into the desert to commit suicide, as his career and marriage were rocky when he disappeared. My only issue with this is again, where was the body and how did he do this if he was not carrying any of his possessions? The most out there theory has to do with UFOs. In Jim's song UFO, he appears to write about witnessing a UFO in the desert, making some wonder if he foresaw his own abduction. This may seem far-fetched, however his family actually do not want to rule this out as a possibility. Lastly, some have speculated as to whether local law enforcement could have been involved in the disappearance. Did they really find out what happened to Jim, but covered it up for some unknown reason? The sheriff initially handling the case did retire before an official investigation started, and he was never questioned about the early investigation. Something that might actually back up a police cover-up came to light in 2017, when John Lorden covered the case on his YouTube series Brain Scratch. One of the viewers decided to submit Jim into the NamUs database. For anyone unfamiliar, NamUs is a national database which provides thorough scientific and forensic information on missing and unidentified people across the USA. NamUs claimed that Jim has never been listed anywhere as a missing person.
Now, I was really surprised when NamUs basically contacted Christie back with the following. I spoke with Santa Rosa PD, who does not have a missing persons case for James Sullivan. They also stated that the Guadalupe County Sheriff's Office does not have a case either. I spoke with the New Mexico State Police, who stated that James has never been listed in New Mexico as a missing person. At this point, we aren't able to pursue James's case from a NamUs perspective. James's family would need to contact law enforcement in New Mexico to discuss filing a missing persons case. So what the heck is going on here? I mean, are we being duped? Is this just some type of internet legend that was drummed up to sell copies of this guy's record way after the fact? I don't know. I'm not sure that I necessarily believe in that. If you recall the story, if you don't, I'll have the original Brain Scratch in the description box below. But if you recall, there was someone that had republished one of his records. That guy's name was Matt Sullivan. He is not related to James. I'm making this video in an effort to get it to Matt. So Matt, if you're seeing this, I'm asking you directly. I know that you met with James's family. I know that you researched this case pretty in depth before you put that record out. We need to nudge his family to get a missing persons case opened. And outside of that, there might be a big question about what happened with this case in the first place. Was it ever listed as a missing persons case? If it wasn't, why not? One of the things that bothered me, and if you look at the previous Brain Scratch, I talked about this, the liner notes for the re-release of Jim's album had a lot of information about the search for him, and one of those things included information that seemed like a police officer didn't really like Jim a whole lot. So is there potentially something going on here where that record was destroyed for some reason? Maybe to cover up what someone had done to Jim? I, once again, don't know, but there are a ton of theories whipping through my head, and the fact that we cannot confirm that he was ever a missing person in the state blows my mind. Either something really bad is going on here in terms of a cover-up, or some horribly bad records management. But in any case, to get this ball rolling in the right direction, Matt, if you're seeing this, if any of Jim's family is seeing this, please contact that local police department, or maybe I would even recommend the state police, and get a missing persons report filed.
I highly recommend John's channel, Lord and Arts, and will link his 2 episodes on Jim Sullivan below. I personally think that Jim had some car trouble that day and left to try and get help. I think he then either ran into foul play somewhere in the desert or succumbed to the harsh weather. I also think there's a possibility that the body found a few weeks later could have been Jim. After all, identification methods in the 1970s were not as reliable as today. It seems almost impossible that another white male over 6 foot tall and with Jim's weight and facial hair happened to die in New Mexico at the same time as Jim. However, stranger things have happened. Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller was an American musician who vanished when flying from England to Paris during World War II. There have been many theories as to what really happened to Glenn, as his body and the plane wreckage have never been found, and there are several strange things surrounding his death. Glenn Miller was the best-selling recording artist between 1938 and 1942. In these years, he and his band had 16 #1 singles and more top 10 hits than Elvis Presley or the Beatles achieved in their entire careers. So as you can imagine, it was a big shock to the public when he announced he was giving up his music career to help the Allied forces during World War II. Glenn was 38 by this time, so he was not initially drafted and was also rejected by the Navy. He then successfully joined the United States Army, where he created a modern band with the intention of lifting the spirits and encouraging the troops. Despite some resistance from more traditional-minded people, Glenn and his band were hugely appreciated and admired. American general and aviation pioneer Jimmy Doolittle stated, "Next to getting a letter from home, that organisation was the greatest morale builder in the European theatre of operations." But Glenn and his music also had another role to play. They were also involved in counter-propaganda against Hitler and broadcast many radio shows in German, with Miller himself denouncing Hitler and fascist oppression throughout Europe. Bear in mind that Miller was one of the top-selling artists of his time, so this could have had a powerful effect on the German people and troops. He was considered more recognised and influential in Europe at the time than President Eisenhower, so I can imagine this was not taken lightly. Now let's look into Glenn's disappearance. On the 15th of December 1944, he took his flight from a former Royal Air Force base in Clapham, Bedford, UK, which was headed for Paris. The flight was organised by his manager with a friend of his, Lieutenant Colonel Bazel, despite several days of bad weather. The weather was not good on this particular day either, with very cold temperatures and fog. The pilot John Morgan was actually refused authorization to fly from his base in Alconbury to Bedford, let alone take the trip to Paris. Bazel, being his superior, demanded that Morgan still take the trip unauthorized. Glenn had a known fear of flying, so his choice to go ahead with the trip seemed out of character to his family. They were quite sure he would have only done this if it was somehow absolutely necessary. Despite Glenn joking that even the birds weren't flying this day, he, Bazel and Morgan take off in the UC-64 Norseman on a course headed towards the English Channel. All that is definitely known from this moment on is that the Norseman lost all radio communication fairly quickly, and its whereabouts are still unknown today. Glenn Miller's disappearance was not announced until December 24th, and the public only found out then because the band were due to do the Christmas Eve concert in Paris. This delay in telling anyone caused further suspicion about the fate of the Norseman. Also, Miller's belongings were removed from his quarters the day after his disappearance, when procedure was to wait 7 days. There is some speculation that there was never an official military investigation into what happened, although this is not true. They did investigate but could not release the findings to Glenn's family because he took an unauthorized flight. This then muddied the waters even more and raised further suspicion. There are numerous theories as to what really happened to Glenn Miller, and the most feasible one being that the engine of the Norseman froze up and the plane crashed into the English Channel. This is indeed what the American military concluded. However, nothing can be officially confirmed until the Norseman and/or the bodies are recovered. A British soldier also recalls an aborted mission on the day Glenn vanished. In those days, bombs had to be dropped from an airplane before it could land, and he remembers seeing a Norseman accidentally get hit and nosedive into the channel. Glenn's Norseman was the only plane of that type to fly that day, and the timing of this incident and Glenn's flight are scarily close in time and location. Another American soldier also remembers taking orders to hit a target that he now in hindsight believes was Glenn's plane. Two differing accounts that both seem extremely credible. I will leave links to both accounts below for anyone wishing to look deeper into the possible theories. As always, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next Mystery Sphere video.